Good afternoon. Today I'm going to be reviewing this album from the Beach Boys, Pet Sounds, released in May 1966. And funnily enough, I never owned this album on vinyl until recently. I picked up this stereo copy. I'd quite like to get a mono copy. And before I go through the album, I just want to tell you how I got into it. This was a wedding present back in 20 years ago, from a friend of mine, Roy Stewart. Thank you, Roy. And this box set is superb because it has outtakes from the sessions. It has the first ever stereo mix of this album. And the reason why a stereo mix had not been done before is I read that Brian Wilson is practically deaf in one ear. That would have made it difficult. But this deluxe set has instrumental only tracks. It has highlights from the recording sessions with Brian instructing the band of musicians, their various parts, and just demonstrating what a complete master producer he is. And then it's even got vocal only versions of all the songs, plus a whole lot of alternate versions. For example, God Only Knows, with Brian Wilson singing the lead vocal as opposed to Carl, and the same with Sloop John B. So very interesting. And this also came with the mono CD and then a nice booklet with detailed sleeve notes from David Leaf, including interviews with the musicians, and also other people like Paul McCartney are interviewed as well. So I think it's generally considered that this album is immensely influential, or was amazingly influential at the time. And just recently I've rediscovered it and just reminded me, and actually appreciated it even more. It really is a tour de force. Brian was asked, is it a concept album? And he said, well, lyrically probably not, musically maybe not, but production-wise he thought it was. I think production-wise it kind of opened the doors and showed people what could be achieved on an album. Up until this point, an album, or maybe up until Rubber Soul, which was released the previous December, albums had primarily been promotional vehicles for singles, or put it another way, a way for the record companies to make money off the back of a single. So put a couple of singles, pad it out with a bit of filler, and you've got an album. Whereas Rubber Soul, Brian was very impressed by the depth of material on that, and the experimentation, and that pushed him to do this. And then by all accounts this album pushed Paul McCartney to do Sgt. Pepper. So whichever way you look at it, these guys were all influencing each other at the time, the mid-60s, and I don't like to say who should get credit for what, but Brian Wilson's name needs to be mentioned at the forefront of 60s producers, and if there is such a word as a genius in pop music, then Brian's name would be one of the ones that I would consider, even though it's fair to say he wasn't as prolific after this album as one would have liked, but that's another story. So on the front cover we've got the band visiting the San Diego Zoo, and some of the band members didn't think much of the cover, or sorry, maybe not the band members, but I think the guy who co-wrote some of the words on this album, or most of the words, Tony Asher, thought it didn't do justice to what they'd achieved. This looks a little bit old school in terms of cover, doesn't it? But I think, it is what it is, and it has a certain charm about it. Kind of, the age before it all went wrong, before drugs took over, maybe. for the Beach Boys anyway, for Brian Wilson in particular. So this is on the Capitol Rainbow label, and very nice 180 gram pressing. They probably have released it on new mono, but I just haven't come across it yet. So the cover is, charming, cute, but maybe not quite as groundbreaking as the music contained inside the cover. And on the back we've got pictures from the band's recent tour of Japan, including Bruce Johnston, who was left off the cover for contractual reasons, but who sings on this album, along with the other Beach Boys. The three brothers, Brian Wilson, Carl Wilson, Dennis Wilson, their cousin Mike Love, and Al Jardine, who's here. And then the other thing I want to show you is this book by Kingsley Abbott, who reckons this is the greatest album of the 20th century. I have it signed here by him, and then goes on to explain why, and it's a perfectly valid opinion. It's one of those albums which one could make a case for sure. And one of the things, the whole book is interesting, but one of the bits I found particularly interesting is the musician credits for the various tracks. And I was surprised to learn that the Beach Boys hardly perform any instruments at all on the album, Brian included. Brian is mainly the producer and obviously writes the music. Tony Asher was brought in to write the words. I don't know if we can find a picture of Tony Asher here. And then we've got various session musicians. Carol Kay on the bass, and these are all seasoned veterans from Los Angeles. Here's Peter Asher. So he wrote most of the words, although Brian came up with the theme of what he wanted the song to be about, and then Peter Asher not to be confused, Tony Asher came up with the words. So these musician credits, in most cases, Brian's singing the lead vocal in most cases, or maybe Carl is on God Only Knows, of course, and Mike Love is singing on a couple of songs such as Here Today. So apart from the vocals and the backing vocals contributed by the Beach Boys and recorded after the instrumental tracks had already been laid down, the musicians are, as I say, seasoned professionals, including people like Hal Blaine on drums, who also played on a number of other hit songs, including Bridge Over Troubled Water, Simon and Garfunkel. Carol Kay I mentioned on the bass. We have another bassist called Lyle Ritz. We've got percussion from Jerry Williams. We've got trumpet from Roy Caton. There's a pianist here. Steve Douglas on flute. Loads of names. Very informative book. This tells you who plays on which track. It says it may not be 100% accurate. Larry Nechtel on organ. Don Randy on the piano. That was it. So we think it's Don Randy who suggested that the staccato notes in the middle section of God Only Knows. And then Brian said, let's try it. And then when they try it, it works. And that's included in the finished master. So the musicians contribute ideas. I think Hal Blaine says on a scale, out of 10, it would be Hal 1, Brian 9. So mostly Brian, I think he scored the parts for each instrument, and the musicians just followed his direction, and you hear it in the outtakes and the recording sessions. He's in complete control of the orchestra. He mentions the instruments by name, the flutes, the trombone, and I want a little bit more of this or a little bit less of that, or a certain phrasing. So he may not contribute instrumental wise to this album, apart from playing organ on That's Not Me, I think it is. But he scores all the parts for the various instruments, and he produces it masterfully, a la Phil Spector, if you like. You know, he's in that league in terms of production, and so that was that. So let's go through the album. Wouldn't it be nice? Maybe it doesn't prepare you for what treasures are to come. It's basically a pop song, but it's very catchy, and maybe lyrically more in keeping with the earlier Beach Boys boy-girl type lyric, but getting a little bit more interesting subject matter-wise, and very nice song. I thought up until recently that this song was a little bit muddy in its production, but I think maybe if you hear it on a proper stereo, it's perfectly okay. It's just if you hear it on a transistor radio, maybe it's a little bit busy in the instrumentation. But I used to think there wasn't enough bass on it, but then I listened to the proper mixes and stuff on a decent stereo, and there's plenty of bass. So really nice opener. You Still Believe in Me is next, and just gorgeous song with brilliant harmonies, and the vocal only version of this on the 30th anniversary box is just heavenly. It's one of Brian's best ever songs and a great favourite. That's Not Me is I think I'm right in saying Mike Love sings the lead on the verses anyway, and then Brian joins Mike on the choruses. And this is a nice song, again relatively straightforward subject matter wise. This whole album, maybe if there is a theme to it lyrically, it would be kind of loneliness and wanting to belong but feeling one does not quite belong, which is probably how Brian felt, and yearning for love and maybe not quite getting it, or maybe dreaming for the ideal type of love. And I'm not sure, to be honest. You could write a book on it probably. Don't Talk, Put Your Head on My Shoulder is just, you know, don't talk, you know. People, what's the George Harrison song? That Is All, when he says, times I find it hard to say with useless words getting in my way. Silence often says much more than trying to say what's been said before. And Brian is saying that in another way to his girl. Don't talk, just put your head on my shoulder. And it's very moving. There's no Beach Boys backing him on vocally on this one. Just a beautiful melody with Brian on his own vocally with the musicians. And then I'm Waiting for the Day is an upbeat number, and just seeing how from the sessions box, how the instruments were built up together, and listening to it without the vocals and then just vocals only. It's just a masterpiece of how he gets all the instruments to blend so well together. Each of them on their own might not be remarkable, but together they really do paint a masterpiece. And I would say that for virtually every track on this album. And Let's Go Away for a While is one of two instrumentals which apparently did have words, but he decided they sounded better without. And very good mood captured by those instrumentals. The other one is Pet Sounds on the B-side, side 2. Then Sloop John B was a hit single before this album came out, and maybe a little bit incongruous in comparison to the rest of the material, but I wouldn't be without it. It's recorded just a couple of months before, so it's not out of kilt or anything. It is obviously the most commercial song on the album, and it was a big hit single, and nothing wrong with it, just not quite as groundbreaking as some of the other material. For example, you turn over and put on side 2, And God Only Knows is, I know it's Paul McCartney's one of his favourite songs of all time. I think it's one of mine. I think it's an absolute gem, production-wise, vocal-wise, melody-wise. A lot of work was put into this, and he gave it to Carl to sing, but actually when Brian sings it, it's almost identical. They were brothers after all. At the end of the day, they had very similar voices, but nice gesture to give it to Carl to sing. And very heartfelt words here, really moving, and it really gets you, this song, time after time. One never tires of it. Listened to a lot of alternate versions of it last night, and I wasn't getting tired of it. I Know There's an Answer is next, and Mike Love has recently been given a credit for this, although I'm not sure he had too much to do with it. But one thing he did have to do with it was, I think he requested for the title of the song to be changed, because it was Hang On To Your Ego, and Mike is singing the lead vocal, and he couldn't stomach singing those words, so he said, can we change it? Probably for the better, because this is more generic as a song, kind of appeals to a wider audience maybe, but I think this song did result from Brian's experience of taking LSD. And hang on to your ego, because maybe LSD helps you lose your ego, and he knows that as an answer, but he wants to find it for himself rather than through some drug, which is admirable. And it's a very affecting song. It's a little bit tinged with sadness if one knows what happened to Brian after this album. For the next few years, he sank into quite a big drug problem. Here Today is another upbeat song with gorgeous instrumentation again. Lead vocal from Mike Love on this one, and great upbeat number. I love it. Fits in well with the overall album. I Just Wasn't Made For These Times is quite a sad song. Again, Brian came up with the theme of what he wanted to write about, but Tony Asher came up with the words, and they're very moving and as I say, quite sad. I just wasn't made for these times. Great lyrics and well played by the musicians. Pet Sounds instrumental, lovely, as we've said. Caroline No is the last track, another gorgeous ballad, and actually released as a solo Brian Wilson single before this album came out. Didn't do very well, so that kind of nixed any ideas of Brian going solo, and it ended up as the last track on here, and it's gorgeous. So this album is the Beach Boys' peak achievement, Brian Wilson's peak achievement more accurately, because I think it was Bruce Johnston who said this was Brian's solo album which he shared with us. So it is in many respects a Brian Wilson solo project, but it's greatly benefited by the harmony vocals of the Beach Boys, and that makes it a better album than it would have been had it been a solo album. So after this album there was some good stuff to come, but perhaps not as much good stuff or great stuff as there should have been. There was the abortive Smile project, as we know, and some good albums such as Friends and 2020 and Surf's Up, but Brian was taking a back seat from here on in, really, and it's a shame. Who knows what he would have achieved. A bit like Syd Barrett in that respect, had he continued at the top of his game, but he kind of opted out. But anyway, when all is said and done, we have this brilliant album, which is often voted at the top or near the top of the albums of all time, deservedly so. I know not everyone's cup of tea, but I'll defend it forever and a day. I think it's an absolute classic. Thank you for watching. See you next time.